Hello, my name is Jason McNamara, and for the next few minutes, I'll be talking to you about the processes by which the Illinois Army National Guard uses environmental specialists to sustain and improve public lands. For this presentation, I will focus on the National Guard, as this is who my internship is through, particularly the Illinois National Guard, more particularly the Illinois Army National Guard. Just like DoD manages the regular Army for federal government, the Department of Military Affairs for Illinois, or DMAIL, manages the National Guard for our state. Before I get into the specifics of NEPA planning and just how NEPA planning pertains to environmental stewardship regarding the military, it's important to know where budgets for this come from. This will give you a better understanding of the planning processes overall. So, how does DMAIL get funding for environmental sustainability? For that, we have to take a trip to Washington, D.C. This is a picture of the Chamber of the House of Representatives, where budgets start, the Capitol building, where they're introduced, and ultimately the desk of the President, where they're approved. And just like the Department of the Interior approves budgets for developing buildings as well as natural resources, so does DMAIL manage funds for facilities, real property, training operations, and all state lands managed by the department. Each year, the President signs the National Defense Budget. Included in this budget are requirements for environmental stewardship of DoD-managed lands. The Sykes Act is one of these requirements. One difference between DMAIL and other state departments in Illinois is that almost 100% of DMAIL's budget is federally reimbursed, including the entirety of the environmental program budget. When we understand its purpose and need, we get a better understanding of its intended purpose. So to see how this budget breaks down, we will take a look at the organizational structure of the Illinois National Guard. And for that, we take a trip to Camp Lincoln. Camp Lincoln is located in Springfield, Illinois, and houses the headquarters of the Illinois Air and Army National Guard. These are sometimes referred to as G staff or general staff. The G represents the head of the state. You may sometimes hear the president talking about G summit meetings, G20 representing the head of the US with 19 other countries. The Army National Guard is broken down into 5 S subgroups. There's 5 major service components, MSCs or S staff. These MSCs include the 33rd Infantry Brigade Combat Team, the 108th Sustainment Brigade, the 404th Maneuver Enhancement Brigade, the 129th Regional Training Institute, and the 65th Troop Command. These 5 MSCs, along with the Joint Forces Headquarters, make up the Illinois National Guard. Each of these are broken down into readiness centers across the state of Illinois. Currently, there are 54 readiness centers and 3 training areas. There are also numerous other managed properties, leases, locally and privately owned training areas used by the Guard. Managing these facilities in Illinois requires the use of several different lines of accounting. Through these, there are multiple agreements made in the form of memorandums of understanding between different agencies and departments. One thing that brings them all together is that they operate using OPM, that's other people's money, taxpayer money. Because of this, the rules of how the money can be spent are highly regulated. As we know, under the National Environmental Policy Act, any federal projects must undergo an environmental assessment process. That process is defined by the Center for Environmental Quality, or CEQ. Within the headquarters company in Springfield, there are groups broken down into G staffs. In addition to G staffs, there are branches. For example, the facilities general staff can be broken down into subgroups. One of these subgroups is the environmental branch. The environmental branch assists all personnel in proper federal, state, and local regulations of an environmental nature. Examples of military environmental specialists include environmental conservation, environmental compliance, or industrial compliance, pollution prevention, and NEPA. The regular Army allocates personnel to support the environmental needs of active military bases. Since states are all different, each state is allocated funds separately to support that military mission of that state. Right now, the Illinois Environmental Branch has 8 personnel in the branch altogether. 2 of them are currently deployed overseas. 1 is on state active duty in support of efforts combating the COVID-19 epidemic, leaving 4 people and a supervisor. My normal position as a natural resources manager or conservation specialist. You can see here in the upper left during an endangered bat mist net survey that we did a few years back. Where this comes into NEPA and planning is when we use the data to show that development of certain projects doesn't affect certain species populations, and we can prove it. In addition to managing T&E species, you can typically find me on an average day managing invasive species or trying to implement natural environmental effects that are now neglected due to human habitation. Oh, and I like bees. In addition to conservation program managers, we assist the military with proper disposal of universal waste and manage for energy usage. We're currently planning to install one of those great big turbines you can see. Personally, after that, I'd like to see us retrofitting all of our property with propane heat that we use now to electric and truly hitting our net zero goals. I could easily spend 20 minutes on each of these talking about military environmental specialist positions all day and ways natural resources can be used to create carbon sink for any business when managed correctly. Instead, for the presentation, we're focusing on the role of NEPA coordinator, as that is the position that I've been working in secondary to my actual position, which is conservation. So now we understand the task organization of the Illinois National Guard, the environmental branch, and how money plays in to environmental budgets. We can start to identify the purpose and need for environmental specialists in the Army as well as DML. So how does defense spending convert into sustainable lands? The answer to that lies in NEPA and projects associated with my experiences as a NEPA coordinator and planning professional. As the NEPA coordinator, making sure that NEPA is done isn't the only requirement. It means being a subject matter expert in every environmental law and regulation that exists on the books in all federal sites and all local areas. This in itself can be rather daunting. Therefore, a big part of my experience was spent studying law and policy. The problem with knowing is that too often project managers don't. And when our compliance team inspects the site, sometimes we have to shut them down. This can all be avoided through proper planning and using NEPA as a process rather than as a hurdle. And it doesn't just stop at MILCON. If you can recall, under NEPA, every federal action requires some level of NEPA. This includes everything from coordinating a class to switching out the motors on rotary wing aircraft to training the force. The requirements of government under NEPA are actually pretty simple. Identify a purpose and need, develop alternatives, address the affected environments, and seek out public comment. However, the Council for Environmental Quality has expounded on this to include addressing some of the language and the addition of past, present, and reasonably foreseeable future cumulative impacts. As long as these are done, a project can't be stopped, at least on the grounds of following the NEPA process. During my internship, I was fortunate enough to get to participate in 2 different conferences hosted by the Shipley Group. So a big part of this experience for me was learning the ins and outs of writing NEPA documents and the importance of planning. So before I go into my specific experiences as a NEPA coordinator for DML, I want to take a hard look at an example when NEPA failed due to misrepresenting how to use it properly, and then we can take another look at what it looks like when done properly. We all remember the Dakota Access Pipeline, right? If we examine this from a legal standpoint, we can see several ways NEPA wasn't followed. NEPA is relatively simple. As I said before, clear purpose and need, address the environmental effects identified and considered, and then, lastly, public stakeholders need to be given an opportunity to review that. So, however, looking at the requirements outlined by CEQ, the agency completing the analysis has to consider a few more things. Will there be any irreversible or irretrievable commitments to resources? In this case, I'd say there definitely were. What are the cumulative effects and impacts? This includes impacts from the environment which result from the incremental impact of the action when added to other past, present, and reasonably foreseeable future actions, regardless of the agency. So essentially, they needed to know what was going on with project development in other areas of the state and the country as well. So furthering these new federal codes, the CEQ developed additional interpretations. New doctrine, including the hard look doctrine, which is based on case law, requires the agency to consider action alternatives with the same level of rigor and time as the preferred action. So they can't just focus on one alternative. They have to put the same amount of effort into all of them that they're considering. The important thing to remember here is that as long as these steps are followed, they can't be used in litigation to stop the project. And in fact, many conservation groups are now getting smart on NEPA and essentially using it as a tool whenever possible to stop land development. So I know what you're thinking. This means that the federal government can basically do just about anything they want, right? Wrong. There's still a litany of other laws and regulations that must be followed. It just means that no one will win in court if they try to use NEPA as the legal driver to stop development. Now, given that said, let's say that NEPA considered every possible course of action. Let's say they considered every possible foreseeable future impact and had zero pushback from the local populace or any civil group. This still wouldn't make the government not liable for any environmental or ecological injury. In fact, this is one of the reasons that CERCLA and FEMA and many other acts regulating funds and money today, since the government can be held accountable even when done correctly, they're still responsible to provide awards for losses and damages and things like that that were unforeseen. In the case of the DAP, the environmental groups felt that they had enough ammunition to sue in federal court under the grounds of NEPA because they felt that the cumulative impacts weren't sufficient, particularly in reference to the Native American lands located nearby. The argument was sustained, was that reference to the distance to the adjacent tribal territories. The end result that the courts found that placing a pipeline 50 yards outside the tribal lands was both arbitrary and capricious. This set forth a new standing in courts that any environmental decision must be based on some kind of science or metric. Of course, there are so many more requirements and considerations that must be made. So many, in fact, that on August 15th, 2017, President Trump signed Executive Order 13807, which mandated agencies to develop new ways to develop NEPA, including using certain language, specific criteria, and reducing the overall length of the end user. As for the DAP, USACE was actually in the process of filing the intent for a new impact statement when President Trump signed orders to move forward and complete the pipeline regardless. That's one of the powers that Congress has. They don't have to follow NEPA if they don't want to. All the protests could have been avoided had proper planning and the use of NEPA correctly taken place. So next, let's take a look at an example when NEPA was successful. For this, we will examine Seattle's Alaskan Way Viaduct. If you're really motivated, you can Google Alaskan Way Viaduct project final environmental impact statement. To many people, this is the Cadillac of environmental impact statements. Some of the highlights of the project is how it gave equal weight to each of the 4 action alternatives. It didn't give a preferred action at all. It allowed the process to decide what was best. It was very easy to read and follow. It addressed cumulative effects and incorporated the past, present, and reasonable foreseeable future impacts. It addressed species as well as social impacts. But I think most importantly, it prepared the community for what to expect and how construction efforts were being minimized to the greatest extent. The final approved project ended up being about $4 billion, and they made their timeshare with little opposition. With the projects that come across my desk, they aren't nearly as daunting as interstate commerce. They still require a process to be followed as to not result in any holdups down the road. During the semester, I had many goals. One of these goals was to update the projects of the Natural Resources Management Plan for my site. The INRAMP is the legal driver for funding and authority to implement natural resource projects on public lands by DMAIL. It requires NEPA. It also requires additional review by a tri-party agency due to legal obligations under the Sykes Act. Essentially, the INRAMP is required to be reviewed by the military, Fish and Wildlife Service, and State Conservation Department, in our case, the IDNR. However, as I learned more about NEPA, the more I realized that to be NEPA compliant, the first step after identifying a needed purpose is scoping. In natural resource management, some of these projects can be assumptive. For example, maintaining the 900 acres of tallgrass prairie and the 1,600 acres of forest at my training site goes without saying. However, how to make that public land available to the public is more ambiguous. My intent is to use NEPA appropriately and, rather than develop every resource management goal before presenting it to the public for comment, reach out to the public to determine what their wants and needs are. One way to do this is through the same methods we've learned here at UIS. Using focus groups and surveys to conduct and develop projects has been one of my new goals. In the end, just like NEPA, it's one of those federal requirements. What gets written into policy doesn't have to be what the public necessarily wants for the process to be legal. However, their scrutiny certainly can make for a better relationship in the Scoping is a process by which proactive and ascertaining feedback prior to developing any draft recommendations for potential courses of action. So rather than develop projects for the use of sustainability for public lands in which I manage, I've developed surveys to help me decide what and how our public lands should be managed. By incorporating to local populace, we're able to keep our future training needs beyond reproach when it comes to public interference. However, not every project is based around natural resources management. Cultural resources and urban development need to be just as susceptible to NEPA. This is why scoping is important when planning to develop in cities as well, and readiness centers. This chart represents the work breakdown structure that you can find in Microsoft Excel. We don't use it, this exact design for planning, but it gives you a general idea to project management. So finally, now we can take a look at some of the projects that I've encountered as a NEPA coordinator. The first project is the development of a multi-purpose machine gun range. This is a potential future project, so it came later after doing some preliminary scoping a few years back. We contracted out the development of a new automated record firing range at the Marshals Training Center, as well as corresponding environmental assessment. The need for the ARF was based on the current design of the range and some of the inefficiencies with the current design with respect to the current operational needs of the Illinois National Guard. What it does, without changing any overall footprint, is reduce the amount of zeroing targets and increase the amount of qualification ranges. These are the pop-up ranges that everybody used to qualify soldiers. They take a lot more time, so there was a need to increase them. This new project didn't need to be incorporated in the EA as it wasn't even considered a future project at that time. And sometimes in order to do more efficient scoping, some more analysis has to be done preliminarily. This is the case with the development of the future MPMG range. These next few slides, we can kind of take a quick look at the products that were created and why scoping is the next step in creating this supplemental EA. So this is just a picture of the SDZ, that's a surface danger zone analysis. It's a small single range, firing range, that we're going to be developing here in the next few years, but it shoots a multitude of different weapon systems, and by integrating the topography, we're kind of able to reduce that surface. And you can see here, it kind of goes outside our boundaries, but with mitigating or potentially leasing some of the land to the east, we might be able to pull it off. And that's why we're kind of really looking towards doing a supplemental environmental. Other NEPA projects were more simpler, but still required baseline surveying and proper permitting. For example, in order for the water purification training team to train more realistically, they required the ability to purify water and return it to the source that it came from. Unfortunately, to purify water is to chemically treat it to make potable and safe. Returning treated water requires an NPDES permit by the EPA. That right, in order to be put clean drinking water in any water of the state, requires a permit. These permits can be really detailed. In this circumstance, I had to contract out a company to isolate every chemical being introduced into the environment. This cost taxpayers thousands of dollars, but it had to be done in order to be able to train our soldiers. And lastly, there are some more routine NEPA actions. These include training that doesn't impact land, as well as renovations to existing buildings. You may wonder why renovating buildings falls under tasks of an environmental specialist, but many of these buildings are very historic. Their designs were built for the purpose and needs of the militia at the time in history. Most of the readiness centers in Illinois are listed as historic preservation sites. Additionally, the Illinois SHPO has now mandated that changes to any state facility be vetted through their office. So some of the training events that were planned before COVID-19 lockdown included coordinating efforts between the state aviation unit to do some Bambi bucket training with me and the replacement of some HVAC systems in some of our facilities as well. So I apologize. I know I'm going to go over my time here, but feel free to stop here. But I want to do a little bit of reflecting and give some of my feedback to my experience. So looking back and reflecting, some of these projects are very simple, but that doesn't mean that they can be overlooked. Many times a quick rec or a categorical exclusion, and you file a paper in a cabinet, boom, legal. However, don't do it, and the end result could be the same as an insufficient EIS or not to any kind of EA at all. If you recall, I mentioned that DML facilities are broken down into branches. Along with the environmental branch is a master planning branch. The branch meets with the G staffs, such as training to ascertain future needs of the force. Remember, without a purpose and need, we can't move forward with any funding, any military construction land development projects. The problem with master planning is that there's no environmental specialists present. I believe that by having an environmental presence, that setting realistic goals and timeshares would be more feasible and efficient. One of my greatest realizations during this period of reflection is regarding what the limitations should be for any professional planner or NEPA manager. Like anything, time is one of the greatest limitations to planning. This is usually because the need for planning occurs after a purpose or need has been established. At least that's been the experience with the military. Rarely do resources get used to plan for events that may occur. Instead, the process of planning is reactionary. It's more common than being preemptory. I mean, why would spend money on something that isn't likely to happen? However, when a need is realized, the funding for planning can begin. The second limitation is resources. The more personnel you have to dedicate to a project, the less time will be needed to see that project to fruition. Between time and resources, the only consideration is the value of those. For example, an experienced forester or heavy equipment operator will save you both money and time in the long run. My experience as a planner has showed me that although I'm capable of recognizing stakeholders, I'm not a professional project manager. This entails a greater understanding of how to apply for the necessary permits and such. Realizing that I needed to develop a SWIP to be used in concurrence with the NPDES permit to construct a new runway for our aerial systems, it was beyond my understanding. Another great realization during my internship is the importance of transparency with stakeholders. What really excites me about doing surveys is that for the first time in department history, feedback from the local population will be used to gather data and drive natural resource management. So that's exciting for me. I feel that this integration from local stakeholders will in fact be met with resistance from management in the beginning, but the status quo for environmental consideration cannot be static. The vastness of the great frontier. And I want to say thank you for a great semester.